Imagine you're standing in a crowded town square. The air is thick with the smell of sweat cider and dust. People are laughing, selling meat pies, lifting their kids onto barrels for a better view. It's not a funeral, it's a spectacle. You didn't come to mourn, you came to watch. That morning, the hanging was supposed to be routine. One trapdoor, one body, one clean, state-sanctioned execution. Justice, they called it. A show of power dressed up in ceremony and law. But what happened next? That wasn't justice, that was carnage. The scaffold cracked, the nooses snapped, and within minutes, the square was a war zone. People screamed. Bodies dropped, some swinging, others splattering. A woman in the front row was crushed under a collapsing beam. A child disappeared beneath a stampede of panicked feet. Horses, bolted guards, panicked swords were drawn, and blood spilled across cobblestones that were supposed to be stained with one man's guilt, not dozens of innocents. One man was supposed to die that day. Instead, the crowd did. And here's the part that should keep you up at night. No one ever answered for it. Not the judge, not the crown, not the men who built the gallows in a hurry with crooked nails and no support. The official record called it public disorder, an unfortunate accident. Then they moved on, buried the bodies, scrubbed the square, pretended the screams never happened. But Weymouth remembered, and buried somewhere in the cracks of that perfect, clean narrative of British justice is the real story one the history books left out. One where the state lost control of its own violence. And when that happens, the gallows don't just kill the guilty, they kill the truth. This is the story of the execution that turned into a bloodbath. And it starts with a scaffold that should have held, but didn't. England in 1685 wasn't just tense, it was ready to snap. Just months earlier, King Charles II had died, and the throne passed to his brother James II, a Catholic monarch in a country soaked in Protestant anxiety. Parliament was uneasy, the streets were buzzing, whispers turned into rumors, rumors turned into unrest. And then one man gave those whispers a flag to follow. The Duke of Monmouth, illegitimate son of Charles II, charismatic, ambitious, and Protestant to the bone. He landed on England's shores like a folk hero, riding high on promises of liberty, rallying the poor, the angry, the forgotten. His rebellion burned bright, but it didn't burn long. Within weeks, his ragtag army was crushed at Sedgemoor. Monmouth himself was dragged to the Tower of London and beheaded in a gruesome, clumsy scene that took 5 swings of the axe to finish. But the real bloodbath was still coming. Because James II didn't just want Monmouth dead. He wanted everyone who stood with him broken, publicly, painfully, and permanently. Enter the Bloody Assizes, a traveling roadshow of vengeance disguised as law, headed by the now infamous Judge George Jeffreys, known even in his own time as the hanging judge. And not for nothing. Jeffreys didn't do mercy. He didn't do nuance. He did spectacle. His court wasn't about justice, it was about dominance. Town by town, he sentenced men, women, even children to hang. No defense, no delays, just names, guilt rope. And the people of Weymouth? They didn't start a rebellion. They didn't carry swords. Most of them barely understood what Monmouth stood for. But that didn't matter. They were guilty by geography, by suspicion, by rumor, by standing too close to the wrong fire when the Crown decided to burn the countryside clean. The execution scheduled for that warm summer morning in Weymouth wasn't justice. It was a message. But when that scaffold collapsed, when everything came undone, the message changed. And the men in charge, they pretended it never happened. Because in monarchies, mistakes aren't corrected. They're buried. To understand how a public execution turned into a massacre, you need to understand the man who orchestrated it, Judge George Jeffreys. You'd expect a monster in robes to be large, loud, physically imposing. But Jeffreys wasn't that. He was small, wiry, and always looked like he hadn't slept in days. But his voice, sharp as broken glass. His stare cold enough to silence a room. He didn't walk into court. He descended into it like a thundercloud in a powdered wig. They called him the hanging judge for a reason. This wasn't some melodramatic nickname slapped on by later historians. It was a title he earned, not because he was bloodthirsty, though he was, but because he turned sentencing into a kind of performance art. Jeffreys knew the law better than anyone in England. That's what made him dangerous. He didn't break it, he weaponized it. He'd twist precedent-bend statutes and deliver death like it was a punchline. He mocked defendants, interrupted prayers, shouted over witnesses. Once he told a man he'd be better served by a hangman than a lawyer. This wasn't courtroom decorum, it was brutality in powdered form, and the Crown loved it. Because Jeffreys did what kings couldn't, he scared people into obedience with a smile. Under King James II, Jeffreys was unleashed across the West Country. From Taunton to Dorchester to Wells, his bloody assizes sentenced over 300 people to death in a matter of weeks. Most didn't get a real trial. Some didn't speak English. Some didn't even know what they were being accused of. And then he arrived in Weymouth. It was supposed to be another stop on the tour, another town square. Another group of traitors marched up the scaffold while Jeffreys watched from a balcony, wine in hand, sermon on the lips. 6 men, 1 platform, 1 message: defy the Crown, and this is your future. What Jeffreys didn't know, what nobody planned for, was that the structure they built to showcase state power would collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. And once that happened, even the hanging judge couldn't control what came next. The gallows in Weymouth weren't just a means to an end. They were a statement, a raised platform right in the center of town, wide enough to hang 6 men at once, tall enough to be seen from every window, every rooftop, every alley. It was theater built with nails and rope, justice as stagecraft, death fully visible. But the truth, it was rushed. Local laborers were forced to build it in days, not weeks, unpaid, under threat, working with warped timber and reused nails. The order had come from above: make it big, make it visible. Nobody cared if it was safe, just so long as it could hold the message. It creaked in the breeze the night before. Townsfolk whispered that it swayed too much, that the beams weren't joined cleanly, but fear overruled engineering. And when Judge Jeffreys demanded elevation, no one said no. You don't argue with a man who calls death a favor to the state. By sunrise, the town square was jammed shoulder to shoulder. More than 1,000 people, some from miles away, had gathered. Mothers hoisted kids onto barrels. Merchants sold cider and cold meat pies. The air buzzed with the sick excitement that only comes before a killing. The 6 condemned men dragged from their cells, pale and bruised, were barely more than boys. Most hadn't fired a weapon. A few had only offered food to rebels, but that didn't matter. Treason was contagious in Jeffreys' eyes, and punishment had to be loud. A priest mumbled scripture. The crowd went quiet. The executioner adjusted the ropes. And then the moment the trap door was triggered. But it didn't drop clean. It split sideways, wood groaning, cracking under pressure. 2 men fell properly. Their necks snapped like twigs. But the rest? One was left dangling by his jaw, twitching. Another slammed into the beam and bounced. A third dropped halfway, then the platform collapsed beneath him, entirely flinging timber and rope into the crowd. The gallows didn't just break. They imploded. And the blood that followed wasn't just from the condemned, it was from everyone. At first, it was just a scream. One voice, sharp and high, from a woman in the front row, splattered with blood that wasn't hers. She backed up fast, bumping into a man holding a baby. The man stumbled, the baby cried. Someone yelled, "The scaffold's coming down," and just like that, the illusion of control shattered. The square turned from a courtroom into a cage. People surged backward, but there was nowhere to go. The narrow lanes that fed into the square were already packed with latecomers, vendors, horses. The crowd moved like water trapped in a bottle, pressure rising, nowhere to escape. Bodies pressed against bodies, panic rose like steam. And then someone, no one knows who, shouted, "They're attacking." Whether they meant rebel sympathizers or spirits or just fate, it didn't matter. In that second, fear metastasized. It became a contagion. Soldiers drew their swords, not to protect the crowd, but to contain it. They slashed the air, screamed at civilians to stand back. Some didn't listen. Others didn't hear. A few were just trying to run. They were cut down anyway. One horse, spooked by the screaming, reared violently, throwing its rider into a knot of bodies. The beast landed hard, crushing 2 people under its hooves before bolting through a bakery window. And in the middle of it all, the scaffold kept breaking. Beams splintered, ropes tangled. A half-hanged man swung sideways, hitting a guard and biting into his face before being stabbed in the gut. Another prisoner slammed into the platform edge and crumpled like laundry. A young boy, perched on a barrel for a better view, was flung by a crashing beam. His skull hit stone. He didn't move again. It was no longer an execution. It wasn't even a riot. It was a massacre. People screamed for their children, for God, for mercy, and none came. Because when the state builds violence into a spectacle, it doesn't plan for when the audience fights to get out. The crowd had come to see justice done. Instead, they witnessed what happens when justice slips its mask and shows you its teeth. By the time the screaming stopped, Weymouth looked like a battlefield. The scaffold was a heap of shattered beams and limp ropes still swaying from half-executed bodies. The square's cobblestones, once swept clean for the spectacle, were slick with blood spit and broken teeth. A cart that was meant to carry 6 corpses now groaned under the weight of dozens, men, women, even children. Some had been trampled, others crushed beneath falling timber. A few were simply lost in the chaos and never seen again. Of the 6 condemned, 4 were dead. One had escaped in the confusion but would be captured and executed days later. The 6th was still alive somehow. He had survived the collapse, survived the stampede, survived being stabbed by a soldier who mistook him for an attacker. But survival was temporary. He would be publicly hanged again weeks later behind closed gates this time, as if silence could rewrite the blood-soaked memory of what had happened. From a balcony overlooking the horror, Judge Jeffries had watched the entire thing unfold. He didn't flinch when the first man hit the ground wrong. He didn't shout when the gallows gave way. Witnesses said he smiled barely and muttered through clenched teeth, "Let them remember it." And they did. They remembered the screams, the way the soldiers struck down bystanders, the mother who screamed for her child and was knocked unconscious with a rifle butt, the baker who found his wife pinned under a beam, the priest whispering prayers over a pile of dead townsfolk. But in the official records, there was no massacre, no failure, no tragedy. The deaths were chalked up to unrest during public proceedings. The square was cleaned, the scaffold hauled away. The stains left behind on the stone and in people's minds were left to fester in silence. No apology was issued, no inquiry opened. The monarchy had turned public justice into state theater, and when the performance spiraled out of control, it did what power always does. It erased the ending. The bodies were buried. The fear was not. And in Weymouth, no one ever built another gallows in the square again. What happens when the state kills but refuses to speak its victims' names? In Weymouth, the silence became a second execution. The deaths weren't mourned in public. No plaques, no mass, no candlelight vigil. The town council met days later and didn't mention a word of it in their records. The mayor issued a brief statement promising restored order. Not a single official referred to what really happened, that a public execution had transformed into a blood-soaked disaster of the Crown's own making. Behind closed doors, families buried their dead in unmarked graves. Some weren't even given names, just vague descriptions scrawled in parish books. Child unknown, woman trampled, man likely a vagrant. The people of Weymouth were told to move on. But how do you move on when your neighbor's daughter was crushed under a platform? When your brother's death was written off as commotion? When the man who ordered it all rode out of town the next morning, headed for the next gallows, the next act? Judge Jeffries didn't just leave destruction in his wake. He left behind a lesson, one he would repeat in town after town, that fear is most effective when it's visible. Not whispered, not suggested, seen, witnessed, absorbed. And in Weymouth, the state learned something too. If you can't hide the blood, reframe it. Soon, rumors began to circulate, not about a massacre, but about divine judgment. Some said the gallows had collapsed because God himself was angry with the traitors. Others claimed rebel saboteurs had triggered the disaster, and gradually, grotesquely, the horror was spun into legend, a kind of victory. Broadsides in London told a different story, that the platform cracked from the sheer force of justice, that the traitors swung so violently they brought down the scaffold in righteous vengeance. No mention of the children, no mention of the civilians, no mention of the blood in the bakery or the boy crushed by timber. Just a myth, printed and sold for a penny a copy. In Weymouth, the truth was buried alongside the dead, and from that day on, remembering it wasn't just an act of grief, it was an act of defiance. You won't find Weymouth in most history books. No tidy textbook paragraph, no classroom discussion, no monument etched in granite. What happened there was too messy, too chaotic, too damning, and the monarchy had no interest in remembering its own failure. But the people did. Not publicly, not loudly, that was too dangerous. But in whispers, in kitchens, behind shuttered windows, the memory lingered. It outlived the blood. It outlived the scaffold. It even outlived the judge. One midwife present that day refused to deliver another child for more than a year. A baker packed up and moved his family inland, telling his neighbors, "The devil passed through this town." Mothers would change their walking routes to avoid the square even after the cobblestones had been scrubbed clean. Children whispered of ghosts. Teachers skipped the lesson on the bloody assizes entirely. And through it all, the official silence roared louder than any scream. The scaffold site remained empty for decades. No shops reopened there. Not even grass would grow, as if the ground itself had decided never again. And yet Judge Jeffreys continued. The monarchy continued. Hundreds more were sentenced across the West Country. More hangings, more silence, more controlled violence wrapped in legal language and national pride. But Weymouth never truly forgot, because forgetting would have meant agreeing with the story being told by those in power that nothing had gone wrong, that the deaths were deserved, that the system had worked. Instead, the people carried that day like a scar, not just as a wound, but as proof of what happens when justice is treated like theater, when fear becomes a currency, and when human lives are reduced to props in a pageant of control. Over time, the town's elders would pass the story down, stripped of dates and details, but heavy with meaning, not as a lesson in law or politics, but as a warning. Because what happened in Weymouth wasn't just an accident. It was a revelation, a moment when the crown's mask slipped, when the ritual of execution revealed its true face, not order, but chaos, not justice, but dominance, not punishment, but performance. And when the curtain fell, the bodies didn't disappear. They stayed, in the blood, in the silence, in the stories that refused to die. Because some executions never end. They echo. By the time Judge Jeffreys rode into the next town, he wasn't a man, he was a myth, cloaked in crimson robes. The people whispered his name the way children whisper about monsters. They didn't speak of him as a judge, but as something worse, an omen, a herald of gallows of grief. And yet there he was, announcing the next round of trials with that familiar shriek of authority and smug calculation. But Weymouth had changed him too, not softened him, hardened him. What happened there wasn't seen by the crown as a disgrace. It was seen as a tool, a warning, a spectacle whose unintended bloodshed could still serve the purpose of fear. Jeffreys didn't deny what had happened. In fact, he used it. In Dorchester, he pointed a gnarled finger from the bench and declared, "You've heard of Weymouth. So understand, justice does not always fall where expected. It falls where needed." The courtroom fell silent, not because they respected the law, but because they feared it would collapse on them next. Because after Weymouth, the rules had changed. It wasn't just the guilty who died. It was anyone close enough to touch the rope. Soon stories spread beyond the West Country, not just of executions, but of the collapse, the panic, the blood, and how the state had said nothing done, nothing changed, nothing. And still the hangings continued. The crown knew one unshakable truth. When violence is performed publicly, And convincingly enough, people begin to fear even thinking the wrong thing. That's what Jeffries had perfected. Not justice, but psychological warfare. He turned the gallows into a message board. Every town he visited received a performance, a grotesque morality play, where the ending was already written. The actors were the accused, the audience the trembling public, and the applause came in the form of silence. Because if Weymouth taught the people anything, it wasn't that the system could fail. It was that the system could fail, kill you, and then call it justice anyway. And no one would speak for you. No one would remember your name, unless someone somewhere decided to turn that silence into a story. Because that's the real threat to power. Not rebellion,